bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. I am the good shepherd that believes in me. I know my sheep, and my sheep I have come down. Just as the Father knows the light of the one who sent me. If you follow me, the bread of you won't have to walk in darkness. Resurrection life, you will never be hungry. I am the way, truth, and life. I know my sheep, even though no one can come to the Father. Whoever lives and believes I am the light of the resurrection and life. This is the living now.
Hey, so good morning everybody. Hope you're all doing really well. If we're meeting for the first time, my name's Pete and it's great to be able to welcome you along to the Forge Online as we dive into part 4 of our series, I Am, where we've been looking at some of these famous I Am statements that Jesus makes about himself. And so far in this series, we've heard from Steve and Johnny as they've covered the statements, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, and I am the bread of life. And this week, we're going to be taking a look at another one of these statements as Jesus proclaims, I am the light of the world. And for me, I've been really excited about bringing this message this morning because it just feels like a great and timely opportunity for a much needed dose of light. See, I don't want to be a whiner here, but for so many of us, it just feels like recently things have been so dark in our world. It feels like every time we turn on the TV or fire up the news apps, it's just more bad news, piling on top of the last lot of bad news from the days and weeks that preceded them. It's just more challenges, more troubles, and more darkness. And I don't want to sound crass about this, but not only is it getting exhausting, overwhelming, and stressful, but it's also getting a little bit boring. Is there anyone else that's just totally fed up of darkness, fed up of more bad news? But one of the things that always causes me to treasure my faith during times like these is that in moments of stress and strain, the Bible is like a treasure trove of light. It's a treasure trove of countercultural, anti-darkness antidotes. That's to say that when the world throws us disappointment, God's word gives us hope. When it throws us cruelty, God's word gives us kindness. And when the world feels like darkness, God's word is a lamp for our feet. And so today I'm excited to be able to share something that represents truly good news that is worth being excited about as we explore what Jesus means when he uses these words, I am the light of the world. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to go out to Fiji and be part of an internship with a group of other Christians from around the world. It was kind of like a spiritual retreat, opportunity to study the Bible, chance to do a bit of outreach and evangelism kind of thing, with 20 other interns from numerous countries and cultures. It was an amazing experience. I got some photographic evidence here. I'm the one stood near the right having an absolute fashion meltdown. I thought prior to going those trousers would be a good idea, help me fit in. It turns out that not only does nobody in Fiji dress like that, but nobody at all dresses like that, and I look like a proper tourist. But after a few days, once everyone had forgotten about the trouser thing, I started to make a few friends. And I found that there was one person in particular that I got on especially well with. This guy called Walter from the US. Really good guy, used to love hanging out with Walter. And me and him were two of the older guys in this group by this point, and we found a lot in common. And one of the things we found in common was that we loved to sit out on this decking area of the training center where we were staying and look out at the beautiful surroundings as the sun was setting and the daylight was fading. And as Walter and I found ourselves sat out there in the cool of the day, we'd often end up getting into quite deep and meaningful conversation. I always found Walter a really engaging person to talk to, and that some of his life experiences had given him a very unique way of thinking about the world. And as we'd sit out there, we'd often just end up putting the world to rights. We talk about all the ways in which the world seemed so broken. We talk about all the things you shouldn't talk about at parties, right? Politics, corruption, religion, philosophy, money, all the stuff that normal people don't enjoy talking about. But we loved it. And whenever we'd have one of these types of conversations about the world and about the parts of it that just seemed so unjust and so in need of change, when those conversations were drawing to a close, Walter would always wrap up the conversation by using this little phrase. He'd say, it's a shady world out there, Pete. It's a shady world. And I always loved that. Because as much as it might have just been a cool little soundbite, Americanism or phrase that he used, I think there's actually something really profound about it. You see, although this world can be an incredibly cruel, unjust, and dark place where there's so much suffering, God hasn't given up on us. And because of that, the light hasn't completely disappeared. And so in many ways, Shady World is actually quite an apt description of this life for the Christian. That though we do live in a dark world, and though the darkness can cast a powerful and intense shadow over us, it can never completely overtake us. Because as the disciple John says about Jesus in chapter 1 of his gospel, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so truly it is a shady world. A shady world that can look and feel like darkness. And then this guy called Jesus hits the scene and starts saying things like, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness." And so today we're going to be thinking about what Jesus means when he says, "I am the light of the world." But we're also going to be thinking about how his light enables us to see the world around us more clearly. In other words, we're going to be asking how his light can help give us vision. How can his light help change how we see things? So first things first, let's take a look at Jesus' words. For this, we're going to head into the Gospel of John, chapter 8, where Jesus is speaking to the crowd at a festival known as the Feast of Tabernacles, which is depicted all throughout chapters 7, 8, and 9 of John's Gospel. For context, in the Old Testament, which is the first 2/3 of the Bible before Jesus' birth, we see Israel called to participate in 3 major feasts: the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And these 3 feasts, although to be honest, in our culture, I feel like it would be more appropriate to think of them as festivals, as they would have lasted multiple days. Anyway, these events occurred during fixed times in the year, at the spring, summer, and fall harvests. And the purpose of these feasts was to remind Israel of past events, as well as teaching them about future events. And before we move on, I want to kind of stick up for the Old Testament a little bit. I want to kind of stick up for some of these feasts. Because I think a lot of the time when we read about stuff like this, the tendency is for us to imagine them as these kind of really boring kind of conference style things where we have to sit and listen for ages and the food's a bit rubbish and nobody's really enjoying it very much. But in researching some of this stuff, I think we've actually got it completely wrong. See, these feasts, or festivals, if you will, would have probably been more like week-long street parties. Events where families would have been building temporary shelters, enjoying good food, and spending special time with one another. And they would have been events shrouded in meaning and interwoven with opportunities to look back at God's faithfulness, as well as to look forward to his promises. Now, I'm not rambling, by the way, this will be important later. But let's pick up the story in John chapter 8, where Jesus is speaking in front of a crowd at the Feast of Tabernacles. And he says this, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And the reason that I spent a bit of time trying to build in some of the wider context in terms of thinking of Jesus' surroundings is that when we consider these surroundings, this I am statement that we're going to look at becomes something more than what we might appreciate on the surface. It becomes not just about what Jesus is, but instead it becomes more about who Jesus is. And actually, that's true of all of Jesus' I am statements. That they're not so much about what Jesus is, but they're actually about who Jesus is. See, we sometimes have the tendency to read these kinds of passages and be unaware of some of the wider context and surroundings, which ultimately leads us to reducing some of the meaning down and saying things like, "Oh yeah, Jesus is light when my life feels dark." And listen, that's true. That's very true. But there's more going on here than just that. See, it's not just that Jesus is light in the darkness. What's happening here is that Jesus is proclaiming himself as the ultimate light from heaven, God himself. So why do I say that? Well, to unwrap this further, we need to go back to the Feast of Tabernacles. And we need to understand what is being celebrated at this feast. And as I mentioned earlier, these feasts were in no small part about remembering where the Israelites had come from, as well as looking forward with confidence to God's future promises. And a big part of this particular feast would have been about remembering God's faithfulness to the Israelites during the Exodus. Now, if you're new to exploring the Bible story, this is the story of God bringing the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and guiding them through the wilderness. It would have been about remembering God's deliverance, provision, and protection of the Israelites during the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness. And one of the things they would have done to celebrate during this Feast of Tabernacles would have been the lighting of 4 large lamps, followed by a nightly celebration which would have taken place under the light, commemorating Exodus 13, 21, and 22, which, speaking of God's presence with the Israelites in the wilderness, says this: "By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people." And this is relevant because this passage in Exodus, this celebration at Tabernacles, and this I am statement of Jesus are all expressing the same idea. That when God's people were lost in the wilderness, surrounded by darkness, and could not find a way forward, God stood before them, lighting the way. And when Jesus chooses this feast, this festival, this time, to come and stand amongst the Pharisees, religious leaders, and Jewish believers, it's not a coincidence, it's a choice. And when he declares himself as the light of the world, he's not just saying, "I'm light in the darkness," or some light during shady days. He's declaring, "I am this same light that led you out of slavery and through the wilderness into freedom." It's like I said earlier, these I am statements that Jesus makes, they're not just about what Jesus is, they're about who Jesus is. They're claims to be God. And he's not just saying, "I am these things." He's showing us that he is the great I am, which is a reference to Exodus 3:14, where when Moses is speaking to God, he asks the Lord, "What if the Israelites ask me your name? What should I tell them?" And God replies, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites: "I am has sent me to you." See, this is how God describes himself, and it's also how Jesus reveals himself as God. I am the light of the world. In Exodus, God is present in the pillar of fire, leading his people out of slavery in Egypt. In the Gospels, God is present in the person of Jesus, leading his people out of slavery to sin. And I don't think it's too much to say that when Jesus arrives at this feast saying, "I am the light of the world," that he is helping them to do the very thing they've come to do at the feast, to remember the past and to look to the future. He's helping them remember where they've come from, God with them in the fire, and he's helping them look forward to what is to come and what has already come, God with them as a man. And in both cases, he will be the one to make a way out of slavery and into new life. He will be the one to make a way out of the darkness and into the light. As we kicked off today, I asked the question, how can God's light help give us vision? How could this light help change the way we see things? But I wasn't talking about how we see our circumstances. Instead, I was talking about how we could start to see the world around us through the lens of God's heart to light up the darkness. And with that in mind, I think one of the key ways that we should think about God's overarching story and his work in our world is like this: that he is always working redemptively. He's always working to restore, to bring about healing, and to light up dark places. And because of that, because of him, there is always purpose and potential, even in the most challenging and unlikely places, because he is always transforming the darkness with the glory of his light and loving kindness. And it sort of reminds me of this old Chinese proverb that I heard a few years ago. It went something like this. A farmer and his son had a beloved horse who helped the family earn a living. One day the horse ran away. Their neighbors exclaimed, "Your horse ran away, what terrible luck." The farmer replied, "What do we know about these things? I guess we'll see." A few days later, the horse returned home, bringing with it other horses. The neighbors shouted, "Your horse has returned home," and brought several other horses home with it. This wasn't bad luck, this was good luck. The farmer replied, "What do we know about these things? I guess we'll see." Later that week, the farmer's son was out riding one of these new horses and it threw him to the ground, breaking his leg. The villagers cried, "Your son broke his leg. This wasn't good luck, it was bad luck." The farmer again replied, "What do we know about these things? I guess we'll see." A few weeks later, soldiers from the National Army marched through the town, recruiting all the able-bodied young men they could find to join the war effort. The farmer's son was not conscripted because he was still recovering from his injury. The neighbors shouted once more, "Your boy is spared. This wasn't bad luck, this was good luck." To which the farmer replied, "What do we know about these things? I guess we'll see." Now, I appreciate this is just a proverb, but it's interesting that even in this short series of events, we can see that things that seem like darkness can be turned around in unlikely ways. And I want you to hear me really carefully with this, because I'm not saying that every bad thing we go through or are going through fits into this way of thinking about life. And I'm certainly not looking to blow past, belittle, or undermine any pain that you've experienced in the past or may be experiencing now. However, I do think that this proverb does a good job of illustrating the fact that darkness can be turned around for light in unexpected ways. And our God is a master of redeeming dark situations in unexpected ways. A God who is constantly willing, able, and working to repurpose the darkness. And that is a hope that all of us need to hold on to, even though in many cases that hope may not be fully realized until we get to the other side of eternity. In October, it will be 9 years since I lost one of my dearest friends. His name was Phil, and at the age of 26, he lost his 9-month battle with lymphatic cancer. A week later, I gave the eulogy at his funeral and tried to honor my friend in the best way I knew how. I spoke about our friendship, told some fun stories, and talked about how much we'd all miss him, and most crucially about his faith in Jesus, as I knew Phil would have wanted me to do that. All the while pushing down some of the lingering questions I had, namely, God, why did this happen to my friend? A good man, a young man with a wife, child, and vibrant faith. After I delivered the eulogy, Phil's wife Fee got up and spoke, and she thanked God that all of our prayers for healing over the previous 9 months had now been answered, that Phil had now entered into his eternal home, was healed and made new in the light of God's great love. That for Phil, as God's word promises, there would be no more crying, death, mourning, or pain, and that the Lord had wiped away every tear from his eyes. Despite her suffering and heartbreak, she taught us all something incredibly valuable: how to see life through the lens of eternity. Why am I telling you this? Well, because with Jesus, the great and true I am, the light of the world, even the most grievous darkness that there is, death itself, will be redeemed by his light. And that when things don't go our way, we don't need to say, "What do we know about these things? I guess we'll see." Instead, we can say, from Psalm 27, "Whatever happens, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" So what now? What do we do with this truth that God is always working redemptively, that He is always working to pursue restoration, to bring about healing, and to light up the darkness. What do we do with that? Well, we join in. We be the light in the world around us, and we share the light with others when opportunities arise. So I want to leave you with a challenge this week, that when this feed ends, wherever you are and whoever you're with, that you would spend a couple of moments in prayer and just ask God, how would you have me be light in the places and spaces that I find myself this week? So that I can be a source of light in darkness, so that my life can point others towards the true and great I am. Thank you so much for listening. Have a blessed week ahead.
Show me how to love.